All right. How's everyone doing today? Good. So again, my name is Megan Lewis, and I'm going to be talking about keeping your tests lean and strategies to scale your automation efficiently over time. So just a little bit more about me. I work at Lever, which is a startup here in San Francisco. We build an applicant tracking system. Chances are, if you have applied to jobs over the past few years, you have used Lever to do so. And we are hiring. So if you're looking for new opportunities, please come chat with me afterwards. I'm happy to talk about what I do on a day-to-day and what Lever what Lever is focusing on. Before I worked at Lever and startups here in San Francisco, I was a consultant at ThoughtWorks for many years. And there I had a chance to work with various size test suites that had existed for a long time, many years. And it was with those test suites that I really had the chance to learn a lot from and really experience the challenges that they come with and kind of managing them over time and kind of seeing points when they kind of get unruly and out of hand. So it is with those test suites that I really, again, learned a lot from, and I'm excited to kind of talk about my experiences with today. So I guess let's just get started. First, I just want to be clear in defining what lean tests mean. So when you hear lean, what do you guys think about? You can feel free to shout things out. All right, healthy, quick, fast, easy to maintain. Yeah, all of those things are great. And I think that's what comes to mind for me too. So when I'm thinking about lean, I'm thinking about three things in particular. The first is valuable test. So your automation test should always be delivering value. There are a lot of things that you can test and even more ways that you might go about testing things, but that doesn't mean that you should test them. Never just automate something because you can. It should always have a purpose. Second is reliable. So with reliable tests, you should be aiming to make them as kind of sturdy as possible. And I think that goes without saying. Like, of course, we want our automation tests to always have consistent results, but I'm sure lots of us have written automation in this room and have experienced flakiness. And I think nothing is worse than putting a lot of time into your automation and having inconsistent results. That can really kind of ruin your test suite. So I'm really excited to talk about reliable tests soon. And third is fast tests. One of the things that I aim to do most as a QA is to help my team move quickly with confidence. And fast tests really help us do that to reduce our build time. And that means that we're able to get new features out to customers quicker. So I'm going to talk about each of these three topics in detail over the course of this session, but first I'm going to just start with a story. And this is a story of the worst test suite that I ever worked with. It was for a client here in San Francisco when I was a consultant, and they had a huge amount of tests, 1,000+ tests to be specific, and I don't think that's the biggest problem. They had definitely scaled over time. This code base had been around for 10+ years, so over time, lots of tests had built up. But I think it was fair to say that these tests had really not scaled well over time because the build took 12 hours to run. Our regression test suite took 12 hours to run, and this was like absolutely absurd to me. They were so long running, in fact, that we had to run them overnight. Because during the day, we didn't really have time to monitor this, and there was lots of resources being used to run these tests. They were run sequentially in Jenkins overnight. And there were so many tests that had some problems. So every morning we would come in, and we would notice that the build had failed, 100% failure rate. Don't look at that for too long. It's kind of disorienting. Like, I don't want anyone to hypnotize themselves, but that is how I felt every morning, walking to the office all happy and just see this failure. And no one was really responding to it. So that was a strange thing for me. And as a consultant, you walk into new clients and you're really excited and optimistic about, changing things within the company, disrupting the status quo. And at first I tried to just observe and kind of understand why people were just kind of ignoring these tests. And it was really easy to see that the team had gotten so insensitized to the results, just the failure, repeated failure, that they didn't really know what to do about it. So I continued to observe, but it was clear that me and my team really needed to decide what to do in order to kind of build the trust back in these tests and have a test suite that we could actually be proud of. So we were determined right then to turn like those sad faces, those faces of frown and despair, into tears of joy. We were determined to get this test suite passing again reliably, and for just to make testing great again within this company, really. So one of the things that we did early on, just kind of like thinking optimistically, was installing a build light for more visibility. So it was red for failing, yellow for in progress, and green for passing, right? So we saw a lot of red, we saw a lot of yellow, as the test continued to build. And it was kind of back and forth between red and yellow and red and yellow. Kind of disappointing. But after many, many months, we one day got to the point where we saw green tests. And I just remember this morning so clearly, after coming into the office and seeing this red light for months, like the morning that I walked in and actually saw the green light, it was the most exciting feeling in the world for me. So I just like to think back at that moment, and it makes me really proud. But so now I want to talk about kind of like how we got to the point where we were able to have a lean test suite and this test suite that we could actually be proud of. And how did we do it, you ask? Was it because we deleted all the tests? Now, this is something that I really wanted to do. I think, again, test suites can grow into this point if you kind of let them kind of grow wild. They can grow into a point where they're so unmanageable, and sometimes it's easier to kind of just start over, right? Especially if these tests have been around for years, there might be some new frameworks in place or kind of new ways that you might be able to do testing. But that unfortunately wasn't what we did. The client QAs that we were working with had spent years kind of writing and maintaining these tests and didn't want to see all their hard work go down the drain. So we had to come to a medium about what we were going to do. And fortunately, we actually were able to delete some tests, and that did make me happy. But for the rest, we kind of needed to come to a consensus about what to do with. And it felt like we were just cleaning them frantically, trying to patch them up, put Band-Aids, and just trying to find ways to make them more reliable and valuable. And it was a long process, but we eventually did it. So now I want to talk about kind of the process that we took in order to get this test suite that we could be proud of. And the first thing that we focused on was this idea of having valuable tests. This is what I think of when I think of valuable, fancy, nice cars. So valuable tests were really important to focus on first because it was easy to see that the QAs kind of were just continuing to add tests, and I don't think we're really thinking about the impact of or kind of the value add of the tests that were being added to this test suite. And I think one important thing that we were trying to instill in this team was that tests should always be providing useful information to your team. Every single test should have a purpose, and you should have some kind of clear output that you're getting out of it. And I think it can happen, especially over many years, that tests can get outdated. And this was something that was pretty clear to see, especially with the tests that had been failing continuously for who knows how long. It was easy to see that they had selectors used in the test that were just so outdated and needed to be updated. There were lots of redundant tests that had kind of a focus in one area in particular, for example, automating every single form filled in a form, going through a drop-down and testing that every single item in the list can be selected. So things like that didn't really make much sense to keep around. And then we also just kind of noticed that some tests were either brittle or kind of just tested in the wrong way, or didn't just completely did not make sense to have around. And I think when you get to this point where you have so many invaluable tests, you have to decide what to do with them. So one of the first exercises that we did was actually to sit down and go through each and every single test and to ask some hard questions about kind of what is each test doing? Is it readable? Is it understandable? Does this test have clear inputs and outputs? is it clear to see what value that this test is providing? Like on the reverse of that, if we didn't have this test, would we be missing out on some coverage? And is this even testing the right thing? Maybe we weren't thinking about the right scenarios, or it's even possible that if these tests had existed for years, that what we were focusing on wasn't even important. Like maybe this feature had completely changed and kind of there was no business value that made it kind of valuable to keep this test around anymore. So after going through and kind of asking these tough questions and understanding the purpose of each test, we were really able to, from there, decide what we were going to delete, update, or keep. And this kind of helped us to just like get rid of a chunk of test immediately. And this is something that I like to continue to do on the projects that I'm on, is to continually kind of reassess the value of all the tests that I have. And I kind of do this on a quarterly basis. It depends, but generally on a quarterly basis, I like to go through and just reevaluate all my tests. And another thing that was important to talk about with this team, that it is about quality and not quantity. Unfortunately, this team had lots of kind of pressures from management about adding tests to kind of meet this coverage limit, you know, trying to like have 100% code coverage and not really thinking so much about the purpose of each test. So I think we had to sit down and kind of talk about this and understand that you shouldn't just be testing, again, you shouldn't just be testing things because you can, like they should have a purpose. And it's kind of useless just to be trying to meet these like coverage goals if you're not actually focusing on the right things. And I think that's when I noticed that it became really important to actually collaborate on tests. And this can happen in lots of different ways throughout the software delivery life cycle. But one thing that I do a lot of now is write test plans and review those with my team cross-functionally. So there'll be developers, PM, design, and we all get together and talk about the scenarios that we plan to test in both a manual and automated level. And that really helps because I might be missing out on some scenarios that they can help me think of. And then it also helps to keep us aligned on the same page about the actual testing that we're planning to do. And then taking it a step further, I would also recommend pairing when you are writing automated tests. So as a QA, I spend a lot of time pairing with developers on actually writing tests, and I think that helps for a couple different reasons. First off, it helps to ensure that more people in the team are familiar with writing, running, debugging these tests. And it also ensures that tests will kind of be implemented in like a technically sound way, which brings me to my next point, that test code should be treated like production code. Ideally, tests would always be written in the same language as your production code. They should live in the same code base, which will help keep your test in sync. And this will also kind of help this will like eliminate any excuses for people not being able to run the test, which is a good point. And you can kind of like keep your app code and your test code on the same level. And that is really great because you shouldn't be kind of looking at your test code and seeing lots of differences between your production code and like noticing that there actually is kind of visible differences and like you can tell who wrote each piece of code. So after coming to a consensus about what valuable tests meant and how we would kind of continue to implement valuable tests going forward, we next focused on reliability. And reliability is always a really interesting topic because it's something that teams just continue to struggle with automation. So one of the things that we did on this team, because we had so many tests, was to split each test down into different directories based on feature. And that made it easier for us to kind of focus on each feature one at a time and to get it passing reliably. Now, tests should always have the same result. The whole point of test is to gain confidence before changing things, and when there are false negatives in the test, they're doing the complete opposite of that. UI tests do often become unreliable, and that just causes a lot more harm than good. So, even one failure makes a difference. You might notice that you start to see more failures kind of seeping into your automation build. And this becomes really annoying. I'm sure we've all been in this point and we hate having flaky tests. But it's just a point that like you get to a point where there are just inconsistent results in your test. And that's unfortunate because the number one benefit about having tests is that you are able to catch bugs faster and then fix these bugs faster. So when you start to have some kind of like undeterministic results, you start to wonder if there are really bugs in your system or if it's your code, your test code, just being flaky. And you might start to hear things from your team like, oh, these tests are failing rather than the build is failing or like, a bug was introduced in the system. So there's really kind of this mindset change that starts to happen on a team. And the more and more that these flaky tests kind of creep into your build, the more that your team is going to kind of distrust them and become insensitized to the results of your test. So some ideas for reliable test. This is something that I always try to do, is to isolate the flaky test right away. And I think with the project that I was on, there were already so many flaky tests. Like this probably wasn't the best situation, but now one thing that I do, especially at Lever, is to like right away, when I see that something has failed more than a certain, 3 times or so, I completely isolate those tests. And isolating can involve simple things such as tagging a test with like quarantine or flaky, or you can also move those tests into a separate directory and run them separately. One thing that I would recommend is for these kind of inconsistent tests is to continue running them as part of your continuous integration build and run them often so that when you are analyzing and then fixing them, you can continue to monitor them as they run in this build. And like after they pass for a certain amount of times, you can move them back to the regular build. And I want to stress that it is important to move the test back to the main deployment pipeline very quickly and not forget about them. Don't just let your tests sit in quarantine, and if you do, that's probably a sign that you probably don't need them anyway, and you might want to think about getting rid of them. And then one thing that is important at helping you understand which test to quarantine is to actually monitor your flakiness. I think it all starts with just monitoring and being aware of the inconsistencies. And so what we do at Lever is to send all of our failures to a Google spreadsheet automatically. And in that spreadsheet, we monitor things like the test, the failure message, and the number of times failed. And then if it's failed, more than 3 times, we will automatically move it over to kind of like a quarantine build and then work on getting that fixed so it's not disrupting our releases. And another thing that might be helpful is to automatically rerun failures. Of course, ideally your test wouldn't fail in the first place, but I think that this can often be helpful, especially when you're dealing with a large number of tests, to just rerun those that failed. So maybe if 1 or 2 tests have failed, you can just quickly rerun those and then kind of continue with your release cycle. One other recommendation is about using specific test selectors. So I have found this really helpful, especially after seeing lots of CSS changes and seeing how failures can get introduced to automation that way, as it's easy to add some kind of unique identifiers in your HTML. And what is really common for me to do is to add a data QA attribute and to specify some kind of like descriptive name. And then my whole team knows that this is in fact being used in automation and it will not change these selectors. So this kind of helps to keep my CSS stable over time, and I won't anticipate failures because of CSS changes. And I think another thing that is important is to focus on independent tests. Tests should all be hermetic, meaning that they should create and destroy data on their own. They should be completely self-contained. And this will benefit in that execution of one test will not affect the execution of another. And then there's going to be more benefits to that when you're able to run your test in parallel and you don't have to worry about conflicts between your data. And also to run in a dedicated testing environment. So I think I've seen this to be pretty common in different projects where we have one testing environment that the whole team uses. And that might be okay, but I found that it's really easy to kind of change the configurations or settings and go and manipulate data in a certain way that might also affect your test. So it might be smart to kind of run in a specific automation or testing environment. So it took a while for us to get to this point where we had reliable test. This was probably what we spent the most amount of time on, actually, is getting to this point where we can have like consistently passing results and monitoring them to this point where we felt happy with like them passing on a consistent basis. So then the next thing that we focused on doing was to have fast tests. And I think that this was kind of the third most important thing for us. Of course, like the tests were so long running and that was pretty disruptive, but I think that it was most important that we come to an understanding about what valuable test meant, then have reliably passing tests, and then focused on how to make them faster. As your test suite continues to grow, you're like quickly going to notice that your builds are going to take longer and longer to run. And I think a common thing when you know that your tests are taking too long is when your team starts to say things like, oh my gosh, these tests are taking forever, and like I'm going to go take a walk while the build is running because I can't wait for the results of these tests. So I think an important thing to remember here is that tests should have a short feedback loop. Especially in continuous deployment pipelines where you have lots and lots of steps. You want to make sure that you are kind of condensing those steps as much as possible so that you're not sitting around all day and waiting for successful builds, especially on days where you are trying to get a release out and you don't want to be kind of waiting around the office all night. It is important to have a short feedback loop. And one thing that I like to do is to come to an understanding about how long my test should actually run. So it usually involves a discussion with my team and sitting down and saying that we want our test to run in less than X amount of minutes. And I think it depends on like how many tests that you might have. But I think it's important to kind of understand that you want your test to kind of run in a certain amount of time. So for example, if we had 12 hours of regression test, it was important for us to like minimize that substantially. So it kind of came, we had to decide for a while about like what that number actually was, but I thought a reasonable amount was going from 12 hours down to 1 hour, which is probably even still long, but just like kind of coming to an understanding of beforehand and then trying to move towards that number and kind of continue to lower your build time. And I think tests should not feel like a marathon. Because definitely at the start of this project, that's what it was like. We would go home at night, come in the morning, see that these tests had run all night. Like it was really like so long running that they felt like a marathon. And again, like in continuous deployment pipelines, there are usually like lots of steps. So this is kind of an ideal deployment pipeline for me. First, it will run unit integration tests, do some deployment to staging, run UI tests, deployments to production, and post-deploy test. So that's already 5 steps. And your deployment pipelines might be a little bit more, a little bit less, depending on the number of steps that you're doing. But it is important to kind of focus on having a minimal amount of build time for all of these different jobs. And some ideas for fast tests. So parallelization is really important and something that I think should be done in any test suite. And there's many ways that you might go about actually parallelizing your test. A great thing that worked in my project was once we had split down all these tests into different feature directories, we were able to put each of those kind of directories as separate jobs in Jenkins, and then within each one of those jobs, we were able to kind of run the test within them across different workers. So we had kind of multiple levels of parallelization there where we were able to kind of focus on what we could do within our test suite as well as how we could leverage our CI tools to run a bunch of tests at the same time. And something else that I always try to remember now is to avoid testing in the UI. I think are you guys all familiar with the test pyramid? Okay, so UI tests sitting there at the top are going to take the slowest, going to be the most brittle, going to be the most expensive tests that you're running. So I think whenever possible now, I'm constantly thinking about ways that I can move my tests down to lower levels of the pyramid. And one thing that when I first started at Lever, we had this goal to automate all of our manual release checkpoints. We had lots of manual release checkpoints. And I think it was a great goal to try to reduce all the kind of manual testing that we were doing. But we started by just adding a bunch of UI tests, and we kind of had to stop, after we had written so many tests and ask ourselves, is this the right way to actually be testing this? Can we be writing tests at a lower level, at like a service or in our unit level? And we started to do a lot more of that and noticed the benefits immediately by adding more unit to our integration test and seeing that they were taking substantially less time than all of the UI tests. And I think another thing that can be helpful, especially if you don't necessarily need to be running your test in the UI, is to consider headless testing. And there's a couple different ways that you can do this. I think the methods that I'm most familiar with are with XVFB, X Virtual Frame Buffer, and Phantom.js. And they both kind of have their pros and cons. I think it depends on what you might be looking for. But this headless test can also help with your execution time as well, because you are not kind of relying on a browser to load, and you're not really worrying about waiting for things to render on the page. It's really easy to kind of just send your test to kind of the headless browser and run them there. And something that I use on my project right now is XVFB, which is really nice because we're actually still able to kind of utilize a real browser and just run this browser headlessly, whereas like Phantom.js is slightly different because you are actually not running your test against kind of a real browser. But they both have their pros and cons. All right, so these are some strategies that I have found to be helpful for maintaining fast, reliable, and valuable tests. I hope that these strategies might help you too. I think you might kind of pick and choose what might be most helpful in certain projects, but I like to kind of keep these strategies in my head as I work on new automation suites and projects in the future, and kind of remember that I can do lots of things to have my tests continue to be lean. So just a few things to remember is that there are often trade-offs. So when I first started working with this huge unmaintainable test suite, we knew that we wanted to focus on a variety of things, having valuable, reliable, fast tests, but that didn't mean that we can do them all at one time. We had to understand that our resources were limited and kind of work through each kind of problem one at a time. And I think it's completely okay to start over. I think, you might get a lot of pushback on this and your team might not agree, but I think, in the months that we spent trying to get these tests to a good state, we maybe could have just deleted everything and completely rewrite them kind of in a nice way, and that could have taken the same amount of time. So can be benefits to sometimes starting over. And lastly, testing is a team effort. I'm often on projects where I might be the sole QA, or maybe there's only one other QA, and I sometimes get intimidated, but I have to remind myself that I'm not solely responsible for the quality of the product quality, but that product quality is really a team effort. So to utilize my team and remember to collaborate them over time so that we can really build a test suite that we can be proud of. So with that, thank you all so much for being here and listening to me. We have about 7 minutes for questions, so feel free to ask me anything. Sure.
You mentioned that code coverage wasn't important, so
thank you.
You mentioned that code coverage wasn't important, and so did you make the decision or with your team that some parts of the app or the site just would go untested completely?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's a good question. So I don't know if it's that code coverage isn't important. I just try to avoid having too much stress on especially things like 100% code coverage, because I feel like that is inevitably going to lead to just writing tests without really thinking about what they're doing, because you're just trying to kind of reach this 100% coverage. So I don't think that it's not important, but I do like to think about just kind of maybe writing different types of tests. So I was saying, avoid the UI, for example. Maybe if we weren't testing things at a UI level, we would focus on testing them at an integration or unit level. So kind of just really diversifying our types of tests and being able to focus on coverage that way, but not being able to really measure like 100% UI coverage, 100% integration, and so like at different levels. I don't think it was most important to have everything covered, but just to really kind of like spread out our focus.
So for the rerun the failures test, so do you think that will mask the actual problems? Because sometimes when you find the test fail and then you run again, it passed, then could that be an actual errors, or how do you determine that it's actually errors or just the environment problems or something?
Yeah, that's a good question. So how do we determine if it's just some kind of like random flaky failure, like maybe there's some kind of environment problem or something unexpected that happened? Those situations are also bound to happen. I think that is something that I like to kind of keep in my head as I see these failures and as they are like recorded to the spreadsheet and like reading through each failure and kind of understanding what the problem was. So I think that's why it just helps to look at the failure message and maybe see how often that you are getting a certain type of failure and what that indicates, because you might see some error messages and know right away that it was kind of just a random thing that happened. You might be getting like some timeouts that are kind of just maybe because your environment is running really slowly, that it's not really the test's fault. But I think that's why it's just important to monitor and to like see how many times that this failure is happening, because I think no matter what, like even if you're seeing lots of like flakiness, that's probably an indication that something needs to change. So maybe it's not at a test level, but maybe you kind of need to see like what's going on with a certain environment, or make sure that, yeah, kind of like I could find ways to kind of mitigate this random failures.
Yeah, the question I have is related more to probably continuous delivery model, but how do you go about versioning your code and syncing it with development source code?
Mm-hmm. So the way that I go about doing that is just keeping test code in the same code base as production code. That's really the best way to go about doing it, because I think if you have your production codes and your test code separately, like you can manage both, and you can make sure both are versioned as long as they are like, you know, in a Git repository, and you're able to really kind of like manage the version over time, but those versions are just not going to match up. So I guess it depends on if it's maybe more important just to have versioned code, or if you want your code to, or your test code to have the same version as your production code.
Can you talk a little bit more about your process about taking code out or taking test code out, and then kind of some of the criteria you use to bring it back in? It's one of the problems that we've kind of faced, and kind of like to see how some of the criteria you've used to bring it back in, and how much automation was there, and how much manual intervention was there in assessing that.
Okay, sure. So this is specifically about bringing back in those quarantine tests?
Yes.
Okay, so for that, that's why it's really important to continue running these quarantine tests. And like, I like to kind of err on the side of just like leaving test in quarantine for maybe a little bit too long. Well, like, just until I am super confident that I know that it's going to be passing reliably. So like I wait for, you know, a certain amount of passes to happen consecutively before I move my test back in. And I think there is a fair amount of like manual kind of observation of this process and when deciding when to bring them back in. I think the automated processes that we have focus more on like when it's failed more than this number of times, just like shoot it over to this quarantine build. But it's like kind of a mix and match of like automated versus manual. We have time for one more question also.
Thanks. Question on the headless browser automation that you did. Can you talk more a little bit about the advantages that you've seen running against headless browsers versus, you know, say, you know, the just a normal browser? Were you able to integrate with Sauce Labs as well?
Oh yeah, that's a good question. I can't speak specifically to the integration with Sauce Labs. I haven't used like Sauce Labs in a while, and I haven't used it in a combination with headless browsers. But I think it just kind of depends on the project. I currently work in like a very JavaScript heavy application, and we wanted to focus on like actually being able to run our tests still like in real browsers. So I think that we just kind of looked through the advantages of XVFB and Phantom.js and found that we were getting a little bit more like reliable like results with running them in XVFB and not having some of the more like inconsistencies with Phantom.js. I noticed that we had to like wait a lot more for things to kind of appear on the page, just doing a lot more waiting for elements, and like just other problems with like Phantom sometimes just like kind of shutting down. So I think we tried them both out, and that's what I would recommend too. Like if you're not sure maybe which tool might be right for you, just doing kind of like a spike and evaluating both tools and seeing maybe which one might work for your application. And sorry, that's all the time that I have. But I will be around after, and I'd love to stay in touch. Here's my contact information, and yeah, I hope to chat with you all after. So thank you so much again for being here. I hope you enjoy the rest of your day.